They said hysteria was a woman's disease, a ghost that lived beneath her skin, rising and falling like the tide. Doctors of the 19th century wrote of it as if it were a serpent of the womb, a restless spirit twisting through the body, making women cry, laugh, faint, rage or desire without reason. And in the dim parlors of Victorian London, where curtains stayed drawn and propriety was worshipped like God, hysteria became the perfect explanation for what men refused to understand. It began, as many horrors do, with silence. In 1859, a doctor named George Taylor wrote, "The womb is a wild beast. It wanders the body, upsetting the order of mind and spirit." He was not alone in thinking so. For centuries, physicians had believed the uterus was not an organ, but a creature, capable of movement, revolt, and rebellion. When a woman wept too often, she was hysterical. When she disobeyed, she was hysterical. When she refused her husband's touch or wanted too much of it, still hysterical. It was a diagnosis made of convenience, a cage built from words and the echo of male discomfort. The more society silenced women, the louder hysteria seemed to grow. By the late 1800s, in cities like London, Paris, and Vienna, nearly 1 in 4 middle-class women were said to suffer from it. Doctors described symptoms that could mean anything: insomnia, irritability, nervousness, melancholy, daydreaming, even poetry. One medical journal listed over 75 symptoms of hysteria, including excess imagination and a desire for independence. In other words, being alive could be a disease. In Paris, the infamous doctor Jean-Martin Charcot turned hysteria into spectacle. He held public lectures at the Salpêtrière hospital, inviting the wealthy elite to witness his hysterical patients, young women convulsing under hypnosis, trembling as he traced symbols on their skin. To the Victorians, it was science. To the women, it was theatre without consent. They called it the Tuesday Lectures, where the afflicted became performers and medicine became voyeurism. The audience, poets, philosophers, even young Sigmund Freud, watched as Charcot declared that hysteria was born not from the body, but from the mind. A revolution of thought, yes, but one that still chained women to the language of weakness. For in Freud's hands, hysteria transformed again, no longer a demon in the womb, but a whisper from the subconscious. He said these women were haunted by memories, desires, and traumas they could not voice. He believed their bodies spoke where their mouths could not. And yet, even this empathy carried a cruel edge. For Freud saw women not as sufferers of society's sickness, but as enigmas to be decoded, puzzles for the male mind to solve. In the drawing rooms of London, hysteria became fashionable. Upper-class women, trapped in corsets and quiet marriages, were told their nerves were simply too delicate for the modern world. They were sent to sanatoriums or into the care of physicians who prescribed rest cures. The rest cure, a name that sounded so gentle, was in truth another prison. A woman confined to her bed for weeks, forbidden to read, write, or think. Her meals measured, her silence demanded. Doctors claimed this rest would restore her femininity, make her soft again, obedient again. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, an American writer and victim of this very treatment, wrote of it in her story, The Yellow Wallpaper. A tale of madness born not from illness but from the slow suffocation of being unseen. I kept still and watched the moonlight on that paper until I felt creepy. The faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern, just as if she wanted to get out. The woman in the story, much like Gilman herself, wasn't sick. She was imprisoned. Her hysteria was not a disease of the body but a protest of the soul, but the Victorians had a way of twisting rebellion into pathology. Every tear, every tremor, every whisper of dissatisfaction, they recorded as proof that woman was not fit for power, for passion, for control. Even as electricity spread through cities and trains shrieked across iron rails, medicine still clung to superstition dressed in Latin. And in quiet offices behind lace curtains, doctors offered new forms of treatment. They called it therapy. They called it cure. They called it science. But the truth was far darker. Because when you name emotion as sickness, you can name control as medicine. And the hands that claim to heal can do anything. if the world believes it's for your own good. By the end of the 19th century, hysteria was the most diagnosed illness in Europe. But beneath its polished diagnosis, beneath the endless lectures, the medical instruments, and the polished marble of hospitals, lay a truth the Victorians could never face. They feared women's voices, and so they called their pain a plague. They feared women's desire, and so they turned it into a disease, and in the name of science, they began to invent cures. They said hysteria could be cured, that if the womb was the source of a woman's madness, then the trembling of her body was a form of healing. It began in the most respectable rooms, chambers lined with velvet drapes and oak cabinets, where physicians in starched collars spoke softly, and patients whispered prayers before the treatment began. They called it pelvic massage, a phrase so delicate it could have been mistaken for poetry. But beneath its civility lay something far more troubling, a ritual born not of compassion, but of ignorance disguised as science. The Victorians believed that hysteria came from a congestion of energy, a pressure building within the female body that needed to be released. And so the doctors of London and Paris began to prescribe manual stimulation to bring about what they called a hysterical paroxysm. In other words, an orgasm. But in those days, they did not name it that way. The word itself was too forbidden, too indecent for medicine. So they cloaked it in the language of healing, pretending not to see the truth of what they were doing. They claimed that after this treatment, the patient would grow calm, her cheeks would flush, her nerves would settle. It worked, they said, and because it worked, they never questioned why. Doctors complained that the process was exhausting. Hours of effort, they wrote, to achieve the proper release. Some even published papers lamenting their aching wrists and hands, as if divine irony itself had punished them for their deceit. It was then that innovation struck. In 1883, a physician named Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville created the first electromechanical vibrator, a device originally meant for muscle treatment, but soon adopted by physicians to assist in the therapy of hysterical women. He called it the percuteur, a small metal instrument powered by a crank, whirring and buzzing with the energy of a new century. The doctor believed he had invented a miracle of modern medicine. He didn't realize he had also invented the world's first sex toy. Across Europe, clinics began to advertise this new electrical cure. Respectable women, wives, daughters, widows, were escorted by carriage to their physicians, where the air smelled of lavender oil and ozone. They lay upon fainting couches while doctors administered treatment, never speaking of what it truly was. It was clinical, mechanical, sanitized, and utterly repressed. They called it medicine so that no one had to call it desire. The therapy spread rapidly. By the turn of the 20th century, there were entire parlors devoted to the treatment of hysteria. Machines grew more advanced, water-powered, steam-powered, electric. Some resembled sewing machines, others great whirring tables. And as the power of the machines grew, so did their popularity. Advertisements began appearing in women's magazines, promoting the portable home massager as a relief for fatigue, melancholy, and nervous ailments. Illustrations showed smiling wives and serene mothers, their eyes closed in blissful repose, their husbands none the wiser. They sold in droves. What the medical journals called a cure had become a secret revolution, an unspoken rebellion against centuries of suppression. In parlors and bedrooms across Europe, women began to reclaim their bodies, though they could never say it aloud. Desire became health, pleasure became therapy. And for the first time in history, the female body was being understood, not through theology or fear, but through sensation. Yet the irony was cruel. Even as the treatment liberated the body, it enslaved the truth. For medicine still refused to call it what it was. Doctors could perform the act, invent the machine, and profit from it. But women were still forbidden to name their own pleasure. One anonymous patient wrote in her diary, he called it treatment, but I felt as if my body was remembering something ancient, a storm, a song I was not allowed to sing aloud. Another woman, years later, would whisper to her daughter, "It was not madness, my dear, it was loneliness." And perhaps that is what hysteria truly was, not a disease of the womb, but a wound of the spirit, a symptom of a world that had taken everything from women, their time, their voice, their right to feel, and then told them that their hunger for freedom was madness. By 1902, the vibrator was being sold openly in mail-order catalogs. It appeared right beside hair curlers and sewing kits, a marvel of modern innovation. And yet, no one spoke its name aloud. It wasn't until the 1920s, when cinema and censorship collided, that society finally began to blush. When Hollywood began using vibration imagery in burlesque and erotic films, the medical profession recoiled in shame. Almost overnight, the vibrator vanished from clinics. Doctors who had prescribed it for decades suddenly denounced it as immoral. They had been caught by their own hypocrisy. The very device that had cured women for half a century was now proof of the desire they had always denied existed. But the story did not end there. For Hysteria, that ghost of medicine, faded not because it was cured, but because the truth finally outgrew the lie. Women began to write, they began to speak, to demand that emotion was not madness, that pleasure was not sin, that the mind and body were not battlegrounds for shame. The diagnosis disappeared from medical books in 1952, but its echo still lingers in the way women are told their pain is exaggerated, their emotions unstable, their bodies too mysterious to trust. The ghosts of those Victorian rooms still haunt us. They whisper through history. When a man cannot understand a woman, he will find a name to bind her with. They called it hysteria. They called it medicine. They called it cure. But it was never science. It was control. And every cure that begins with silence is still a wound waiting to speak.